Jamal Foster, a 16-year-old with an insatiable passion for wildlife photography, was often drawn to the dense woods that bordered his suburban neighborhood. Armed with his old but reliable camera, he would spend hours capturing images of the natural world, finding solace among the trees and creatures that seemed to exist in their own untouched realm. For Jamal, these moments of solitude offered a reprieve from the suffocating undercurrent of tension that seemed to define his life in this predominantly white, upper-middle-class neighborhood. Though his family had lived there for years, Jamal could never shake the feeling of being an outsider. The woods, however, were different. They didn't judge. They didn't whisper behind his back or glare when he walked by. Here, Jamal could dream freely about his future, becoming a renowned wildlife photographer, traveling to exotic places, and documenting the beauty of animals most people would never see. Today, though, something felt different. There was a peculiar stillness in the air, a quiet that seemed to wrap around him like a warning. The birds, usually chirping incessantly, had gone silent, and the distant rustle of leaves sounded sharper, more deliberate. It was then that Jamal spotted a coiled, striking figure glinting under the dappled sunlight. A snake, and not just any snake. Its scales shimmered with hues of gold and black, its body thick and muscular, and its head lifted slightly as if aware of his presence. Jamal's heart quickened with excitement. This was no ordinary find. It was a rare species he had only read about in books. Carefully he raised his camera, adjusting the lens to capture every detail of the snake's intricate patterns. He crouched low, steadying his breath to avoid startling the creature, and began snapping photos. Unbeknownst to Jamal, someone else was watching him, someone who did not see the wonder of nature or the innocence of a boy pursuing his passion. From the second-floor window of a nearby house, Mr. Walter Anders peered through a pair of binoculars, his lips pressed into a hard line. Anders was a man defined by his paranoia and bitterness. A retired military officer in his late 50s, he had moved to the neighborhood 5 years ago, bringing with him an arsenal of firearms, a web of security cameras, and a deep-seated mistrust of anyone he deemed different. To him, Jamal wasn't a curious teenager exploring nature. No, in Anders' warped mind, Jamal was a threat, a trespasser, a potential thief, maybe even a gang member. Anders watched as Jamal edged closer to the snake, his camera clicking softly. The boy's movements seemed deliberate, almost calculated to Anders. He didn't see a camera, he saw a suspicious object, perhaps a tool to scope out the neighborhood. His jaw tightened, and he set down the binoculars. Anders had been waiting for an opportunity like this, a chance to finally assert himself, to send a message to anyone who thought they could cross him. Without a second thought, he grabbed his shotgun from the rack by the door, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped outside. Jamal didn't hear him at first. He was too absorbed in his photography, marveling at the snake's slow, hypnotic movements. But then came the sharp crunch of boots on gravel, and a cold, menacing voice that cut through the stillness. "Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Jamal froze, his hands tightening around the camera. Slowly he turned his head to see Anders, standing a few yards away, his shotgun loosely aimed at the ground, but ready to be raised at a moment's notice. The older man's face was hard, his pale blue eyes burning with suspicion and hostility. Jamal felt his throat tighten. "I'm just taking pictures," Jamal stammered, lowering the camera slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "There's this snake, and it's really rare." "I don't give a damn about your pictures," Anders snapped, stepping closer. "You're on my property, boy." Jamal glanced around, confused. He hadn't realized he'd crossed into Anders' yard. The forest had no clear boundaries. and he'd been so focused on the snake that he hadn't paid attention to where he was going. Raising his hands defensively, Jamal tried to explain. "Sir, I didn't mean to trespass. I was just—" "Don't give me that crap," Anders barked, his voice rising. "I've seen you sneaking around here before. Always lurking, always up to something. You think I don't notice?" Jamal's heart raced. He'd never spoken to Anders before, but he'd heard the stories of how the man had chased off kids from the neighborhood, how he'd once fired warning shots at a delivery driver for parking too close to his house. Jamal knew he had to stay calm, but the weight of Anders' gaze, the shotgun slung across his chest, and the venom in his words made it almost impossible. "I swear, I wasn't sneaking around," Jamal said, his voice trembling. "I just wanted to photograph the snake. That's all." Anders sneered. "Do you think I'm stupid? I've seen your kind before. You think you can just wander wherever you want, take whatever you want? Not on my watch." The words hit Jamal like a slap. Your kind. He didn't need an explanation to know what Anders meant. Heat rose to his cheeks, but he bit his tongue. Arguing would only make things worse. He had to get out of there. "Okay, look," Jamal said, stepping back slowly. "I'll leave. I didn't mean to cause any trouble." But Anders wasn't done. The man's hand tightened on the shotgun as he gestured toward Jamal's camera bag, which lay on the ground near the snake. "What's in the bag?" Anders demanded. "Just my camera gear," Jamal replied. "That's all." "Open it." Jamal hesitated. The bag was near the snake, and any sudden movements could provoke it. He tried to explain this, but Anders wouldn't listen. "I said open it." Anders shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. He raised the shotgun slightly, the threat unmistakable. Jamal swallowed hard, stepping toward the bag with slow, deliberate movements. His hands trembled as he unzipped it, revealing the camera equipment inside. Anders squinted at the contents, his expression unreadable. "Pick it up," Anders ordered. Jamal did as he was told, lifting the bag carefully to avoid startling the snake. But as he did, the snake began to move, uncoiling and slithering toward Anders. The older man took a step back, his eyes widening slightly, but his grip on the shotgun remained firm. "Get out of here," Anders growled, his voice low and menacing. "And if I ever catch you here again, it won't end with me just talking." Jamal didn't need to be told twice. Clutching his bag, he turned and hurried away, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, but he could feel Anders' eyes on him, drilling into his back like a physical weight. As he disappeared into the trees, he promised himself he would never return to that part of the woods. But fate had other plans. This was only the beginning. The next morning, Jamal sat at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. The memory of the previous day's encounter with Mr. Anders replayed in his mind like a bad dream. He hadn't told his parents what had happened. He didn't want to worry them or spark a confrontation. His father, a proud man who worked tirelessly to provide for his family, would have stormed over to Anders' house and demanded an apology. His mother, a teacher, would have insisted on filing a complaint with the homeowners association. But Jamal knew neither action would lead to anything good. Anders wasn't the type to back down, and a complaint would only escalate his hostility. Instead, Jamal decided to bury himself in his photography. He scrolled through the images on his camera, hoping the beauty of the snake would distract him from the bitterness Anders' words had left behind. The photos were stunning, each scale glimmered in the sunlight, its golden and black pattern mesmerizing. Despite everything, Jamal felt a surge of pride. He'd captured something truly remarkable. But his sense of accomplishment was short-lived. As Jamal reviewed the last few images, he noticed something strange. In the background of one photo, barely visible through the blur of leaves, was a figure. It was Anders, holding his shotgun, watching him from the shadows. Jamal's stomach turned. He hadn't realized Anders had been following him even before their confrontation. The thought made his skin crawl. Pushing the unsettling image out of his mind, Jamal decided he needed to return to the woods. Not to Anders' property, but deeper into the forest, where he could lose himself in the serenity of nature. He grabbed his camera and backpack, determined to shake off the lingering anxiety. The woods were quiet as Jamal stepped onto the familiar trail. The early morning light filtered through the canopy above, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves. Jamal inhaled deeply, letting the calmness of the forest wash over him. This was his sanctuary, a place where Anders and his hateful words couldn't reach him. As he ventured further in, Jamal spotted a small clearing ahead. He recognized it immediately, the spot where he'd photographed the snake. Cautiously he approached, scanning the area for any signs of danger. The snake was gone, likely retreating deeper into the forest. Jamal felt a pang of disappointment. He had hoped to see it again, to capture more photos. He knelt by the patch of grass where the snake had been coiled, adjusting his camera to focus on the subtle impressions it had left in the soil. He didn't hear the sound of approaching footsteps until it was too late. "Didn't I tell you not to come back here?" The voice froze Jamal in place. He looked up, his heart sinking as he saw Anders standing a few feet away, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. Unlike the previous day, there was no trace of mockery in Anders' expression. His face was set in a grim mask of fury, his eyes cold and unyielding. "I'm not on your property," Jamal said quickly, rising to his feet. He held his hands up in a placating gesture. "I'm just here to take pictures." "You don't get to decide where my property ends," Anders snapped, taking a step closer. "You think I didn't notice you sneaking around again? You're just like the rest of them. Always testing boundaries, seeing how much you can get away with." "I wasn't sneaking," Jamal protested, his voice shaking. "I didn't even know you were out here." Anders laughed bitterly, a harsh, grating sound that sent a shiver down Jamal's spine. "You expect me to believe that? After yesterday, you're lucky I didn't deal with you properly then. But now you've crossed the line." Before Jamal could respond, Anders lunged forward, grabbing him by the arm. The sudden movement caught Jamal off guard, and he stumbled, dropping his camera. Panic surged through him as Anders dragged him toward a large tree at the edge of the clearing. "Let me go," Jamal shouted, struggling against the older man's grip. "You can't do this." Anders ignored him, his grip tightening painfully. "You need to learn a lesson," he growled. "People like you think you can walk all over men like me. You think I'm weak, that I won't stand my ground. Well, guess what, kid? You're wrong." Jamal's mind raced as Anders pulled a length of rope from his belt. The realization of what was happening hit him like a punch to the gut. Anders wasn't just trying to scare him, he was serious. Jamal thrashed against him, but Anders was stronger, his grip unrelenting. Anders shoved Jamal against the tree, forcing his arms behind him. Jamal winced as the rough bark scraped against his skin. Anders worked quickly, binding Jamal's wrists tightly with the rope. The boy struggled, but the knots were too tight. He was trapped. "Why are you doing this?" Jamal demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "I didn't do anything to you." Anders stepped back, admiring his work with a twisted smirk. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about you. This is about making sure people like you know your place." Jamal's stomach churned at the words. He tugged at the ropes, but they only dug deeper into his skin. "You're crazy," he said, his voice cracking. "You're going to get in so much trouble for this." Anders laughed again, a chilling sound that made Jamal's blood run cold. "Trouble? You think anyone's going to care? No one around here is going to take your word over mine. You're nothing, kid." As he spoke, Anders glanced at the ground, his eyes narrowing. A slow, malevolent grin spread across his face. He reached down and picked up something from the grass. Jamal's heart stopped as he realized what it was, the snake. It was coiled tightly around Anders' gloved hand, its body writhing as it tried to escape. Anders held it up, examining it with a mix of curiosity and malice. "Look at this little beauty," he murmured. "Didn't think I'd see you again." He turned back to Jamal, his grin widening. "You're lucky, kid. I'm not going to kill you. But this fella, he might." Jamal's breath caught in his throat as Anders stepped closer, holding the snake mere inches from his face. The creature's forked tongue flicked out, tasting the air. Jamal could see the tension in its coiled body, the subtle movements that hinted at its readiness to strike. "Please," Jamal whispered, his voice barely audible. "Don't do this." Anders ignored him. With deliberate slowness, he draped the snake over Jamal's shoulders, its cold, scaly body pressing against his skin. Jamal froze, his entire body trembling. He could feel the snake's muscles shifting as it adjusted its position, tightening slightly around his neck. "There," Anders said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Let's see how tough you really are." Jamal's breaths came in shallow gasps as he fought to remain still. He knew any sudden movement could provoke the snake. His mind raced, searching for a way out, but no solution came. He was trapped, at the mercy of a man who had none. This was no longer about photography or trespassing. This was survival. Jamal's world had narrowed to the feel of the snake's cold, muscular body pressing against his skin and the sound of Anders' heavy breathing. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to do something, but he knew even the slightest twitch could provoke the snake. Its head was now resting near his collarbone, its body shifting slightly with every breath he took. He could feel its tongue flicker against his neck, tasting the air. His heart raced, each thump pounding in his ears like a drumbeat. Anders stood a few feet away, leaning casually on his shotgun, his lips curled in a cruel smirk. He seemed to relish the sight of Jamal frozen in terror, as if this was all some twisted game to him. "Look at you," Anders sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "All that big talk and now you can't even move. Guess you're not as tough as you thought, huh?" Jamal didn't respond. His jaw clenched as he fought back tears. He wasn't going to give Anders the satisfaction of seeing him break down, even if every part of him wanted to scream. His mind raced, trying to focus on the one thing he knew about snakes. They reacted to fear and sudden movements. He needed to stay calm, no matter how impossible that felt right now. Anders began pacing in front of him, tapping the barrel of the shotgun against his thigh. "You know, I could have called the cops on you," he said conversationally, though his tone was anything but friendly. "But what good would that do? They'd slap your wrist, maybe give you a little warning, and you'd be back here next week causing more trouble. Nah, you need something that sticks. A real lesson." Jamal's voice trembled as he finally spoke. "This isn't a lesson. This is torture. Let me go." Anders stopped pacing and turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "Torture? You don't know the first thing about torture, boy. This is discipline. Something your kind clearly doesn't understand." He stepped closer, leaning in so that his face was inches from Jamal's. The smell of tobacco and whiskey wafted from his breath. "You think you can just wander into my world and do whatever you want? Not a chance. Jamal stared back at him, his fear beginning to mix with anger. You're insane, he said, his voice steady despite the snake coiled around him. This isn't your world. These woods don't belong to you, and I'm not afraid of you. Anders' smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He straightened up, his grip tightening on the shotgun. Not afraid, huh? We'll see about that. He took a step back and pointed the shotgun at the ground near Jamal's feet. Without warning, he pulled the trigger. The deafening blast echoed through the clearing, and dirt sprayed up around Jamal's shoes. The snake flinched at the noise, its body tensing as it pressed tighter against him. Jamal clenched his teeth, refusing to cry out even as the snake's scales dug into his skin. You feel that? Anders barked, his voice rising. That's the sound of power. That's the sound of control. And guess what? I'm the one holding the trigger. Jamal's hands strained against the ropes binding him to the tree, but they held firm. He wanted to lash out, to fight back, but he was completely at Anders' mercy. You're a coward, he said, his voice low but steady. You think this makes you strong. It just proves how weak you really are. Anders' face darkened, his smirk disappearing entirely. He stepped forward again, raising the shotgun so that the barrel was level with Jamal's chest. You've got a big mouth for someone in your position, he growled. Maybe I need to shut it for you. Jamal's heart pounded as Anders pressed the barrel against his chest. The cold metal sent a shiver down his spine. He forced himself to meet Anders' gaze, refusing to look away. Go ahead, he said through gritted teeth. If you're so strong, do it. For a moment, the two of them stared at each other in silence, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Then, to Jamal's surprise, Anders pulled the shotgun back and let out a harsh laugh. You're not worth the bullet, he said, shaking his head. But don't think for a second that means you've won. Anders turned away, his eyes scanning the clearing as if looking for something. You see, I don't need to hurt you myself. Nature has a way of taking care of pests like you. He glanced back at the snake coiled around Jamal, a cruel smile spreading across his face. It's only a matter of time before it decides you're too much trouble to keep alive. Jamal felt a surge of panic as the snake began shifting again, its head lifting slightly as it tested the air. He forced himself to take slow, steady breaths, trying to keep his fear in check. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice calmer than he felt. You can still stop this before it gets worse. Anders laughed again, but this time there was a hint of unease in his tone. Worse? Boy, you don't know the meaning of the word. But you will. Suddenly, the sound of rustling leaves broke the silence. Both Jamal and Anders turned toward the noise, their bodies tensing. From the shadows of the forest, a large buck emerged, its antlers glinting in the sunlight. The deer paused, its ears flicking as it surveyed the scene. Anders snorted. Stupid animal, he muttered, raising his shotgun, always wondering where it doesn't belong. Jamal's breath caught as Anders took aim. Don't, he said urgently. It's not doing anything wrong. But Anders ignored him. With a loud crack, he fired a shot into the air, startling the deer. It bolted into the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The blast echoed through the clearing, and the snake around Jamal shifted again, its body tightening further. This time, Jamal couldn't hold back a cry of pain as the pressure on his chest and arms became unbearable. Anders turned back to him, his smirk returning. See that? Even nature knows when it's outmatched. Maybe you should take a lesson from that deer and learn your place. Jamal glared at him, his anger bubbling to the surface. You don't own nature, he spat. And you don't own me. Anders' smirk faded once more, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. You think you're clever, don't you? But clever doesn't mean smart. And smart doesn't mean safe. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Let me tell you something, boy. Out here in the real world, people like you don't get second chances. You mess up, you pay the price. And right now you're paying. As he spoke, Anders reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. The blade gleamed in the sunlight, its edge sharp and menacing. Jamal's blood ran cold as Anders held it up, turning it slowly so the light caught every angle. This here, Anders said, his tone almost conversational. This is my insurance policy. In case that Snake doesn't finish the job. Jamal swallowed hard, his mind racing. He needed to find a way out of this, and fast. But with his hands tied and the snake still coiled around him, his options were limited. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, sharpening his senses as he searched for any opportunity to escape. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something. The snake's head was moving again, but not toward him. It was turning toward Anders, its tongue flicking out as it seemed to sense the man's movements. Jamal's pulse quickened as a glimmer of hope sparked within him. Anders, he said, his voice steady despite the fear bubbling beneath the surface. You think you're in control, but you're not. That snake, it doesn't care about me or you. It's just waiting for the right moment. Anders frowned, glancing down at the snake. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. What are you talking about? Jamal took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. You think it's just going to sit there? It's scared. And scared animals strike first. The words had barely left his mouth when the snake lunged. Its head shot forward with lightning speed, its fangs sinking into Anders' forearm. The man let out a howl of pain, dropping the knife as he staggered back. The snake recoiled, its body tightening momentarily around Jamal before it released and slithered to the ground. Jamal didn't waste a second. With Anders distracted, he twisted his hands against the ropes, using the momentary slack to pull free. His wrists burned as the rough fibers scraped his skin, but he didn't care. He was free. Jamal's heart pounded as he wrenched his wrists free of the rope. The burning pain where the fibers had scraped his skin was nothing compared to the adrenaline surging through his body. He had no time to think, no time to process the fact that the snake, the same creature Anders had used to terrify him, had now turned against his captor. All he knew was that this was his chance to escape. Anders stumbled back, clutching his arm where the snake had bitten him. His face contorted in pain, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The shotgun slipped from his grip, falling to the ground with a dull thud. The venom was working quickly. The bite had landed near a vein, and the swelling around the wound was already visible. Anders' bravado, his cruel smirk, was gone, replaced by panic. You little Anders started, but his words slurred as he swayed on his feet. His free hand scrambled for the knife he had dropped, but his coordination was failing. His knees buckled, and he fell hard onto the dirt. Jamal staggered forward, his legs stiff from being bound for so long. He glanced down at the man who, just moments ago, had been taunting him with a loaded shotgun. Now, Anders was reduced to a gasping, trembling figure, his once dominant posture crumbling under the effects of the venom. Jamal could feel a surge of anger rising in him, a part of him wanting to scream at Anders, to ask how it felt to be powerless. But there was no time for vengeance. The snake was still there, coiled on the ground between them, its head raised and ready to strike again. Jamal froze, his eyes locked on the creature, his breath shallow. The snake's focus was shifting, its tongue flicking as it turned toward him. Jamal realized with a jolt that it wasn't done. Moving slowly, he backed away, his hands raised in a calming gesture. He remembered what he'd read about snakes. They reacted to movement, especially sudden or aggressive gestures. He needed to stay calm, even as his pulse thundered in his ears. The snake hesitated, lowering its head slightly, as if uncertain whether to pursue. Then, with a flick of its tongue, it turned and slithered into the underbrush, disappearing as swiftly as it had appeared. Jamal let out a shuddering breath, his knees nearly giving way. He wanted to collapse, to let the fear and exhaustion wash over him, but Anders' rasping groans snapped him back to reality. The man was still on the ground, clutching his arm, his face pale and sweaty, his eyes wild and desperate, locked onto Jamal. "Help me," Anders choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Jamal didn't move. He stared down at the man who had humiliated him, terrorized him, and used a deadly snake as a weapon against him. Every instinct told him to turn and run, to leave Anders to face the consequences of his own cruelty. But another part of him hesitated. As much as he hated Anders, he couldn't ignore the man's suffering. No one deserved to die like this. Jamal knelt cautiously, keeping a safe distance as he looked at Anders' wound. The skin around the bite was swollen and discolored, and dark veins were spreading up his arm. Jamal recognized the signs from his research. The venom was attacking fast. Without antivenom or immediate medical attention, Anders wouldn't last much longer. "I need my truck," Anders croaked, nodding weakly toward the edge of the clearing. "Keys in my pocket." Jamal glanced in the direction Anders had indicated and saw a battered pickup truck partially hidden behind a thicket of trees. It was Anders' salvation and his potential escape route. But the keys were still in Anders' pocket, and the man wasn't in any condition to retrieve them himself. Summoning his courage, Jamal edged closer. He reached down, his fingers trembling as he searched Anders' pocket. The man flinched at the contact, his body convulsing slightly, but he didn't resist. Jamal's hand closed around the keyring, and he quickly pulled it free, stepping back as Anders let out a groan of pain. "You're gonna need a hospital," Jamal said, his voice tense. "This venom is serious. If I leave you here, you're dead." Anders' eyes flickered, a hint of fear breaking through the haze of pain. "You're not leaving me," he rasped. "You owe me." "Owe you?" Jamal snapped, his anger bubbling to the surface. "For what? For tying me to a tree? For threatening me with a gun? For using a snake to try and kill me?" Anders didn't respond. His head lolled to the side, his breathing shallow. Jamal clenched his fists, torn between the urge to help and the desire to let Anders suffer. Every logical part of him screamed that this man didn't deserve his help, that he should just take the truck and leave. But as much as he wanted to hate Anders, he couldn't ignore the pang of guilt gnawing at him. If he walked away now, Anders would die, and that blood would be on his hands. With a frustrated sigh, Jamal made his decision. "Stay here," he said, his tone cold. "I'll get the truck." He sprinted toward the pickup, his legs burning with every step. The keys jingled in his hand as he reached the door and unlocked it. Sliding into the driver's seat, he jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The engine roared to life, and Jamal let out a breath of relief. He gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes darting to the road ahead. For a brief moment, he considered driving off, leaving Anders behind. He could be miles away before anyone noticed. But something stopped him. He couldn't bring himself to leave, not like this. Gritting his teeth, he shifted the truck into gear and turned it toward the clearing. Anders was barely conscious when Jamal returned. The man's body was limp, his head lolling against his shoulder. Jamal jumped out of the truck and ran to him, grabbing him under the arms and hauling him to his feet. Anders let out a weak groan, his legs barely supporting his weight. "You're heavier than you look," Jamal muttered, dragging him toward the truck. "Come on, stay with me." He managed to get Anders into the passenger seat, his body slumping against the door. Jamal climbed back into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel as he glanced at his passenger. Anders' breathing was shallow, his skin pale and clammy. He didn't have much time. Jamal floored the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward as it sped down the dirt path. The forest blurred past them, the trees closing in like shadowy sentinels. Jamal's mind raced as he calculated the distance to the nearest hospital. It would take at least 20 minutes, maybe longer, and there was no guarantee Anders would make it that far. As the truck bounced over the uneven terrain, Anders stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked at Jamal with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Why are you? Why am I helping you?" Jamal finished for him, his voice sharp. "Good question. Maybe it's because I'm not like you. Maybe it's because I don't leave people to die, no matter how much they deserve it." Anders' lips twitched as if he wanted to respond, but no words came. He slumped back against the seat, his breathing growing fainter with each passing moment. The road eventually widened, the forest giving way to open fields. Jamal gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing, if saving Anders was even worth it. But deep down, he knew one thing. He couldn't let this man's hatred turn him into something he wasn't. As the hospital came into view, Jamal pressed harder on the gas, his determination outweighing his doubt. He wasn't doing this for Anders. He was doing it for himself, to prove that even in the face of cruelty, he could choose compassion. The truck screeched to a halt in front of the emergency entrance, and Jamal jumped out, shouting for help. Medical staff rushed to the vehicle, pulling Anders from the passenger seat and placing him on a stretcher. Jamal stepped back, his hands shaking as he watched them wheel the man inside. For the first time in hours, he felt the weight of what had happened crash down on him. He didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jamal sat alone on the curb outside the hospital, his hands trembling as he stared at the truck he had driven to save Anders. The vehicle loomed like a ghost, a haunting reminder of everything that had just transpired. Inside the hospital, Anders was being treated for the venom coursing through his veins, his life hanging in the balance. Jamal's body ached, his wrists raw from the ropes that had bound him, and his mind raced with conflicting emotions. He had done the right thing, hadn't he? He could have left Anders to die and no one would have blamed him. But now that Anders was here, alive and in the care of professionals, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. A man like Anders wouldn't let this go. He would come for Jamal, twist the story to paint himself as the victim. Jamal knew it was only a matter of time. The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled Jamal from his thoughts. A black SUV rolled into the hospital parking lot, its dark windows reflecting the early afternoon sun. Jamal's heart sank as two uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicle. One was a tall, burly man with a hard-set jaw, while the other, shorter and stockier, surveyed the area with sharp, calculating eyes. Their presence sent a chill down Jamal's spine. They were here for him. "Excuse me," the taller officer called out. Approaching Jamal, his tone was neutral, but his expression carried an edge of authority that made Jamal's stomach tighten. "Are you the one who brought in Mr. Anders?" Jamal nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, I brought him." The shorter officer exchanged a glance with his partner before pulling out a notepad. "Mind telling us what happened?" Mr. Anders is in critical condition. He mentioned your name before losing consciousness. Jamal's pulse quickened. Of course Anders had mentioned him. But what had he said? Did he blame Jamal for the snake bite? Did he twist the story to make himself look like the victim? Taking a deep breath, Jamal decided to stick to the truth. It was all he had. I was in the woods, Jamal began, his voice steady despite the anxiety clawing at his chest, taking pictures of wildlife. Anders showed up, accused me of trespassing, and it escalated. He tied me to a tree, used a snake to scare me. Then the snake bit him. The taller officer raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. He tied you to a tree? Used a snake? That's quite the story. It's the truth, Jamal said firmly. You can check the area where it happened. There's rope, my camera equipment, it's all there. He had a shotgun too. The shorter officer jotted something down in his notepad, his expression unreadable. You're saying he assaulted you? Yes, Jamal replied. And he threatened me. But I didn't leave him there. I brought him here because I didn't want him to die. The taller officer's lips pressed into a thin line. Why didn't you call the police earlier? If what you're saying is true, this is a serious crime. Jamal hesitated. The truth was, he hadn't called because he didn't trust them. Not in this neighborhood, not with people like Anders. I was scared, he admitted. And I didn't think anyone would believe me. The officers exchanged another look, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the shorter one closed his notepad and nodded. Stay here. We're going to check in with the hospital staff and see what Mr. Anders has to say. As they walked away, Jamal felt a wave of unease wash over him. He knew how these things worked. Anders had the advantage he was older, white, and a respected member of the community. Jamal was a black teenager. The narrative would almost certainly favor Anders, no matter what the truth was. The minutes dragged on like hours as Jamal waited, his mind cycling through every worst-case scenario. He could already hear the accusations, trespassing assault, maybe even attempted murder. If Anders twisted the story enough, Jamal's life could be ruined. The officers returned, their expressions grim. The taller one spoke first. Mr. Anders' condition is stable for now, but he claims you attacked him. Says you provoked the snake and refused to help him until it was too late. Jamal's jaw dropped. That's a lie. He's the one who tied me up. He threatened me with a shotgun and used the snake to scare me. You have to believe me. The shorter officer held up a hand. Calm down. We're not making any decisions yet. But this is a serious situation. We'll need to investigate further. For now, we're going to need you to come with us. Come with you? Jamal repeated, his voice rising. Why? I didn't do anything wrong. It's standard procedure, the taller officer said, his tone firm. We need to take your statement formally. You're not under arrest, but we can't ignore Mr. Anders' accusations. Jamal clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. He's lying. You're taking his word over mine, because he stopped himself, knowing that finishing the sentence wouldn't help his case. But the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. Look, the shorter officer said, his voice softer now. If what you're saying is true, we'll get to the bottom of it. But you need to cooperate. Jamal hesitated, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Finally, he nodded. Fine. Let's go. The ride to the station was tense. Jamal sat in the back of the SUV, staring out the window as the officers exchanged occasional murmurs up front. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Would they believe him? Would they even bother to investigate? Or would they take Anders' word and make Jamal the villain? At the station, Jamal was led into a small, sterile room with a table and 2 chairs. The shorter officer sat across from him, while the taller one leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. They asked him to recount everything that had happened, from the moment he entered the woods to the drive to the hospital. Jamal told them everything, leaving nothing out, even the parts that made him look vulnerable. He hoped that his honesty would be enough to sway them. When he finished, the shorter officer closed his notepad and sighed. "That's quite the story," he said. "If it's true, Anders is in a lot of trouble." "It is true," Jamal insisted. "I'm not lying." The taller officer pushed off the wall, his expression skeptical. "You have to understand, Mr. Foster, this isn't an open and shut case. Mr. Anders has a clean record and a lot of credibility in this community. You, on the other hand." "Me, on the other hand, what?" Jamal snapped, his temper flaring. "I'm black. I'm a teenager. That automatically makes me a liar." "That's not what I said," the officer replied, his tone sharp. "But your actions don't exactly paint you as innocent. Trespassing, for one." "I didn't know I was on his property," Jamal interrupted. "And even if I was, that doesn't give him the right to do what he did." The shorter officer held up a hand. "All right, calm down. Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Jamal slumped back in his chair, his anger giving way to exhaustion. "I'm telling the truth," he said quietly. "You can check the clearing. The ropes, the shotgun, my camera bag, it's all there." The officers exchanged a glance. Finally, the shorter one nodded. "We'll send someone to check it out. In the meantime, you'll need to stay here." "What?" Jamal's heart sank. "For how long?" "Until we get confirmation," the taller officer said. "If your story checks out, you'll be free to go. But if it doesn't..." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Jamal swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he rested them on the table. He was trapped, just like he had been in the woods, and there was no snake to blame this time, just a system that seemed determined to see him as guilty. As the officers left the room, Jamal leaned his head against the table, his mind racing. He could only hope that the evidence in the clearing would be enough to prove his innocence. But deep down, he knew the fight was far from over. Jamal sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, his thoughts spiraling as he tried to piece together how everything had gone so wrong. The silence in the station was oppressive, broken only by the faint murmur of voices from the other side of the door. His wrists still throbbed from the ropes Anders had used to tie him, and the events of the day replayed in his mind like a nightmare on repeat. He was trapped again, only this time by the system itself. No ropes bound him now, but the weight of suspicion and the overwhelming power of Anders' lies felt just as suffocating. Jamal clenched his fists, trying to keep his growing frustration from boiling over. He had done everything right. He had saved Anders, brought him to the hospital, told the truth. And yet, here he was, sitting alone while his captor was likely spinning his own twisted version of events to the police. The door to the room creaked open, and the shorter officer, the one who had taken his statement earlier, stepped inside. His expression was unreadable, and a heavy folder rested under his arm. He sat across from Jamal, placing the folder on the table with a deliberate thud. "We've sent officers to the clearing," the officer began, his tone measured. "They found the ropes and the evidence you mentioned. The shotgun was there too, along with your camera bag. So far, your story checks out." Jamal felt a glimmer of hope, but the officer's expression didn't soften. That said, the officer continued, "We've also spoken to Mr. Anders. His version of events paints a very different picture. He claims you trespassed with intent to harm him, that you provoked the snake and used it as a weapon. He insists that everything he did was in self-defense." Jamal's jaw tightened. "That's a lie," he said firmly. "He's twisting everything. He tied me up. He used the snake against me. I saved him, Why would I bring him to the hospital if I wanted to hurt him? The officer leaned back in his chair, studying Jamal carefully. That's what we're trying to figure out. You have to understand, Mr. Anders is a respected member of the community. People are going to believe him over you unless we have concrete evidence. Jamal's frustration boiled over. Evidence. You have the ropes, the shotgun, the snake bite on his arm. What more do you need? The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. Calm down, kid. Yelling at me isn't going to help your case. Before Jamal could respond, the door opened again, and the taller officer stepped inside. His face was grim, and he carried a small object in his hand, Jamal's camera. He placed it on the table and slid it toward Jamal. We found this in your bag, the taller officer said. There's a memory card inside. If what you're saying is true, maybe it'll back up your story. Jamal's heart raced. He hadn't thought about the photos he'd taken that day. If the camera had captured anything, it could be the proof he needed. He reached for the camera with trembling hands, fumbling with the buttons as he pulled up the images. The officers leaned in, watching over his shoulder. The first few photos were of the snake in the clearing, its scales glinting in the sunlight. Then came the shots with Anders in the background, standing with his shotgun and watching Jamal from the shadows. The officers exchanged a glance but said nothing. As Jamal continued scrolling, his breath caught. There it was, a clear shot of Anders tying the ropes around Jamal's wrists. Another photo showed Anders holding the snake, its body draped over his arm as he sneered at Jamal. That's it, Jamal said, his voice shaking with relief. That's the proof. He can't deny what he did now. The officers stared at the photos, their expressions shifting. The shorter one nodded slowly, while the taller officer's face remained tight. This does help your case, the taller one admitted, but we'll still need to corroborate this with the rest of the evidence. Jamal slumped back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. He had fought so hard to tell the truth, to make them believe him. Maybe, just maybe, it was finally enough. But then the taller officer's radio crackled to life. He raised it to his ear, listening intently as a voice relayed information. His expression darkened. Understood, he said tersely before lowering the radio. What is it? The shorter officer asked. The taller one turned to Jamal, his gaze hard. Anders just checked himself out of the hospital. He's refusing further treatment and is on his way home. Jamal's blood ran cold. What? He's leaving? He needs medical attention. He could. He's determined, the taller officer said curtly. And angry. If I were you, I'd stay away from him until this is resolved. Jamal's heart sank. He knew what that meant. Anders wasn't going to let this go. The man's hatred burned too deep. If he was willing to put his own life at risk just to escape the hospital, there was no telling what he'd do next. Hours later, Jamal was finally allowed to leave the station. The officers had taken his statement, confiscated the evidence, and promised to conduct a thorough investigation. But Jamal knew better than to put all his trust in their promises. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as he stepped out into the night. The crisp air bit at his skin as he walked toward the truck, the vehicle he had driven to save the man who now wanted to destroy him. As he climbed into the driver's seat, his mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He couldn't go home, not yet. If Anders was free, there was no guarantee he wouldn't come after Jamal or his family. He needed to protect them, to make sure Anders couldn't hurt anyone else. Driving aimlessly through the quiet streets, Jamal's mind drifted back to the clearing. The place where everything had spiraled out of control. Something pulled at him, a gnawing feeling that he needed to return there. Maybe it was the need for closure, Or maybe it was the hope of finding something he'd missed, a piece of evidence that would ensure Anders couldn't twist the truth any further. When he arrived, the clearing was eerily silent. The moonlight cast long shadows across the trees, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. Jamal stepped out of the truck, his footsteps crunching softly on the ground as he approached the tree where he had been tied. The rope still hung there, frayed and blood-stained. As he examined the area, a sound behind him made him freeze. The sharp crack of a branch snapping underfoot. He spun around, his heart pounding. A figure emerged from the shadows, illuminated by the faint glow of the truck's headlights. It was Anders. The man looked worse than before, his face pale and drawn, his arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. But his eyes burned with a feral intensity, and in his good hand he held the shotgun. "You couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" Anders growled, his voice low and venomous. "Had to drag the cops into this, make me look like the bad guy." Jamal's breath caught as Anders raised the shotgun, the barrel aimed squarely at his chest. "Anders, you need help," Jamal said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "You're not thinking clearly." "That venom." "I don't need your pity," Anders spat. "I need you gone." Jamal's mind raced as Anders' finger hovered over the trigger. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping a man who was consumed by hatred, a man who would rather destroy everything around him than face his own demons. Jamal's eyes darted to the truck, where his camera bag lay on the passenger seat. If he could reach it, maybe he could use the tripod as a weapon or find something to distract Anders. But the shotgun was too close, and Anders' grip was steady. As the tension reached its breaking point, Jamal made his move. With a burst of speed, he darted to the side, grabbing a fallen branch from the ground and hurling it at Anders. The older man fired, the shot echoing through the clearing as it struck a tree behind Jamal. The two of them clashed in the moonlight, predator and prey, locked in a final, desperate struggle. The deafening crack of the shotgun echoed through the clearing as Jamal dove to the ground, narrowly avoiding the blast. Splinters of bark flew from the tree behind him, scattering across the dirt like shrapnel. His heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, every muscle screaming at him to run. But he knew there was no escape, not yet. Anders stood a few yards away, his face twisted in rage, his shotgun still smoking from the last shot. "You think you can outsmart me?" Anders bellowed, his voice hoarse but filled with venom. "You think you can walk away from this?" Jamal didn't answer. His eyes darted around the clearing, searching for anything he could use to defend himself. The clearing was littered with debris, branches, rocks, the ropes Anders had used to bind him, but nothing seemed sufficient against a man armed with a loaded shotgun. Anders took a step forward, his hands trembling as he tried to steady the weapon. The venom from the snake bite was taking its toll, sweat poured down his face, and his movements were sluggish. But his hatred was undiminished, driving him forward despite his failing body. "You're just like the rest of them." Anders spat, his voice quaking with fury. "Always pushing, always taking what doesn't belong to you. But not this time. Not from me." Jamal's anger flared. He was tired of being spoken to like he was less than human, tired of being treated like a criminal for simply existing. For the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt defiance. "You think this is your world?" Jamal shouted back, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "You don't own these woods. You don't own me. You're just a coward with a gun." Anders' face contorted, and he raised the shotgun again, his aim shaky but deadly. Jamal's mind raced. He couldn't outrun the shot. He couldn't fight Anders head-on, but he could outthink him. Without warning, Jamal lunged toward the tree where the rope still hung. He grabbed the dangling end and yanked it hard, pulling it free from the bark. Anders hesitated, momentarily thrown off by the sudden movement. Jamal used the distraction to dart behind the tree, putting it between himself and the shotgun's line of fire. "Get out here!" Anders roared, advancing slowly. "You can't hide forever." Jamal's hands worked quickly, knotting the rope around his wrist to create a makeshift lasso. He peeked around the tree, calculating the distance between him and Anders. It wasn't far, but it was enough. If he timed it right, he might have a chance. Anders took another step forward, his breathing labored, his face pale. "You've got nowhere to go, boy. Just give up." Jamal didn't respond. He waited, his muscles coiled like a spring, until Anders was close enough. Then, with all the strength he could muster, Jamal swung the rope. The looped end arsed through the air and landed perfectly around Anders' shotgun, jerking it downward just as the older man pulled the trigger. The blast went wide, tearing into the ground inches from Jamal's feet. Before Anders could recover, Jamal charged, slamming into him with the full force of his weight. The shotgun fell to the ground, and the two of them tumbled into the dirt, grappling for control. Anders was stronger, but his movements were sluggish, his strength sapped by the venom coursing through his veins. Jamal fought with everything he had, adrenaline fueling his every move. He managed to wrest the shotgun away and toss it out of reach. Anders swung a fist, catching Jamal in the side, but the blow lacked power. Jamal retaliated with a sharp elbow to Anders' ribs, sending the older man sprawling onto his back. For a moment, the clearing was silent except for their ragged breathing. Jamal stood over Anders, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. He could end this now. One more blow, and Anders would be too weak to fight back. The man deserved it. He had terrorized Jamal, humiliated him, tried to kill him. And yet, as Jamal looked down at him, he felt no satisfaction, only pity. "You're done," Jamal said, his voice steady. "It's over." Anders glared up at him, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "You think you've won?" he rasped. "This isn't over. It's never over." Jamal shook his head. "It is for me." He turned and walked away, leaving Anders lying in the dirt. He retrieved his camera bag from the truck and slung it over his shoulder, his steps steady despite the pain coursing through his body. He didn't look back. By the time Jamal reached his house, dawn was breaking over the neighborhood. The faint glow of sunlight spilled over the rooftops, painting the quiet streets in soft gold. Jamal stood on the porch for a moment, letting the calmness wash over him. His parents would be awake soon, and he knew there would be questions he wasn't ready to answer. Not yet. He slipped inside, moving quietly through the house until he reached his room. Closing the door behind him, Jamal sank onto his bed, his body heavy with exhaustion. He set the camera bag on his desk and stared at it, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. The memory card inside held the truth, proof of Anders' actions, but Jamal wasn't sure what to do with it. Part of him wanted to hand it over to the police, to let the evidence speak for itself. But another part of him wanted to forget, to leave the nightmare behind and move on with his life. He knew, deep down, that the choice wasn't just about him. It was about what was right. 2 days later, Jamal sat in the same interrogation room at the police station, the memory card in his hand. The shorter officer from before sat across from him, his expression unreadable. "This is it," Jamal said, sliding the card across the table. "Everything you need to prove what happened." The officer picked up the card, examining it for a moment before nodding. "You're sure about this?" Jamal hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, it's the truth. The officer didn't say anything, but there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes as he stood and left the room. Jamal sat back in his chair, the weight in his chest finally beginning to lift. He had done what he could. The rest was out of his hands. A week later, news spread through the neighborhood. Anders had been arrested, charged with assault and unlawful imprisonment. The evidence from Jamal's camera had been irrefutable, and even Anders' reputation couldn't protect him. Jamal watched from his porch as the police escorted Anders out of his house in handcuffs. The man's eyes met Jamal's for a fleeting moment, filled with hatred and something else, fear. Jamal didn't look away. He stood tall, unyielding as Anders was driven away. For the first time in days, Jamal felt a sense of peace. He had faced the worst and survived. More than that, he had fought for the truth and won. The woods were his sanctuary again, not a place of fear but of freedom. And no one, not even Anders, could take that from him.